All right, everybody, it's a big week 9 of college football as we eye that next Tuesday when we hear finally what the selection committee thinks about all this mess and who they would deem as the 4 teams for the college football playoff. But who cares about that right now? We got some football to watch this Saturday specifically, and we bring in Joe Lisi of GoForThe2.com. We can't do it without Joe. Thanks so much for joining us, Joe. We're going to dive right into it in the Big 12. We had a huge 3-game series in the Big 12 that started to decide some things, and I think the team that really benefited from last week's play is Kansas State. They are the clear front runner. They've got a lot of good teams to get through to the finish, so not declaring them the champ by any stretch, but they're the only favorite in this thing that has 0 losses in conference play right now. They're getting a visit from Texas at Kansas State, Joe.
You look at this matchup, Kansas State dominant victory, in my opinion, on the road in Norman last weekend. I know they gave up 533 total yards to the Sooners, but they were able to win the turnover battle and, more importantly, Mark, win the special teams battle, which is a recipe for success on the road in these top 10 matchups. Jake Waters, in my opinion, a solid performance in picking apart that OU secondary, and I think I like Kansas State in this matchup as they travel back to Manhattan against a suspect Texas team. Texas playing much better over the last couple of weeks, got a victory 48-45 over a solid Iowa State team. 2 weeks ago, challenged OU in the Red River rivalry, couldn't get the victory. But I think when you look at this matchup with Kansas State, very physical offense and defensive lines. I think they wear down Texas, and you look at the depth of that Texas defense, I think Oklahoma could not take advantage of the rushing attack against that Texas defense. Kansas State can, and I think it's a dominant Kansas State victory on Saturday night. They play disciplined football.
Yeah, they definitely do. I don't think they have the talent of a Oklahoma State, Baylor, or Oklahoma, but that doesn't matter. If you coach them up and you can play them and put them in the right position and play fundamental football as Kansas State typically does, then that shores up a lot of talent gaps. And for Kansas State, I don't know if I'm going to upset some Wildcat fans, but I think Jake Waters is a more complete quarterback than Colin Klein was, even though he was the top 3 in the Heisman voting. Jake Waters has developed as a passing quarterback to complement what he can do on the ground, and I watched that football game gun to gun with Oklahoma. Very impressed with Kansas State, and of course Tyler Lockett, one of the best in the biz on the outside. We got West Virginia taking on Oklahoma State. From week 1, Joe, I'm going to give you some due here, going to give you some cred that you told us to look out for West Virginia. They took Alabama down to the last 5 minutes, and this has turned out to be a pretty legit football team that took out Baylor, and it really wasn't that close at home. Now the Mountaineers go on the road to Oklahoma State. The Cowboys looked very shoddy against TCU, losing 42-9 last week. So you get the Mountaineers taking on the Cowboys.
Well, I appreciate the credit, but this West Virginia team, Mark, living very dangerously. Let's talk about the performance last week at home against the 4th-ranked Baylor Bears. A dominant defensive victory. They held Baylor to 95 total yards rushing. Baylor 2 weeks ago got 270 rushing yards against a very solid TCU defense. You look at Baylor's performance, 3 of 16 on 3rd down conversions. Mark, they had 18 penalties for 215 yards. They won the turnover battle against West Virginia and still dropped that ball game by double digits. You look at Clint Trickett, 2,520 passing yards, and Kevin White's already over 1,000 receiving yards on the season. Credit Dana Holgorsen. This team has the ability to come back from deficits, and they're playing very, very well. But they're minus 11 in turnover margin, Mark. They're 123rd out of 125 teams in turnover margin. Michigan is dead last in turnover margin. Then at 124 is SMU. At 123 is West Virginia at minus 11 on the year. In order to win on the road, you need to create turnovers and you need to win the special teams battle. They're going to be going on the road to Stillwater. They haven't won there since 1929. So there's a very difficult place to play. I know the Cowboys are coming off a disappointing road loss to TCU, but that's a solid TCU top 10 team, I like Oklahoma State in this matchup. I don't like the fact that West Virginia is creating too much turnovers. They're having a very productive season, but I think Oklahoma State at home wins this matchup on Saturday.
I was really high on Oklahoma State possibly pulling off an upset or at least covering at TCU, and that totally imploded. The thing I also like about West Virginia here is that their secondary matched up better with Baylor's receivers than anybody we've seen in the last couple of years. They played really well in the secondary in holding down Bryce Petty and really limiting the big play against Baylor. But West Virginia, like a lot of teams, a much different team on the road than they are at home. So we will look out for that game as well. Let's move on to the Big Ten, and we've got a matchup here that's typically huge. This season, not so much, but still huge for Michigan State to continue to win. They get a trip from in-state rival Michigan. The Wolverines finally break through with a victory against Penn State. Michigan State not looking like the dominant team that we expected in recent weeks. They hang on against Nebraska. They hang on against Purdue. They finally put on the throttle and really put the stomping on Indiana in the second half. So we've got a game with Michigan State hosting Michigan.
What I like with Michigan State right now is they're very balanced on the offense. You look at Connor Cook last week, Mark, over 300 yards passing, 3 touchdowns, only 1 interception, and Langford really runs between the tackles. You're talking about a Michigan team dead last in turnover margin at -13, got the victory over Penn State. Now they got to travel on the road to a rivalry game, but I still like Michigan State in this matchup. I think that when you look at it, offense and defensive lines will dictate the tempo of this game, and I'm not sold in Devin Garner in a big spot. Very inconsistent. I know he's heard the criticism, but until he starts getting more consistent in the passing game, there's no way I can like Michigan at this point in the season. I know that they have a week off to prepare for this matchup. This is their season, but I still like the Spartans to dominate this game on Saturday.
You know, Joe, Ohio State seems to be a different team than the one that lined up against Virginia Tech. It's not just J.T. Barrett. It's the defense is playing much better. At the same time, Maryland's decent. Rutgers is decent. So the Buckeyes are basically doing what was expected of them and dominating marginal teams. Penn State, you could possibly put the Nittany Lions in the same category. We're going to see what the Buckeyes are really made out of a couple weeks down the road at East Lansing against Michigan State. But for right now, possibly a tricky game at Happy Valley against Christian Hackenberg. And if that makeshift offensive line for Penn State can give him some time, maybe they've got a puncher's chance against Ohio State.
I could see where you're talking about Penn State coming off the bye week, having a week off to prepare for J.T. Barrett, but this Buckeye offense, Mark, hitting on all cylinders. When you look at J.T. Barrett's performance from the Kent State game heading into the Rutgers performance, 14 touchdowns heading into that game. He tore up a solid Scarlet Knight secondary, not only with his legs, but with his arm. He's a dynamic quarterback that has learned the system over the last couple of weeks, and you're talking about a significant speed advantage for Ohio State in this matchup against Penn State. Penn State depleted in my mind in the secondary. I like Ohio State's wide receivers. I think they dominate this matchup in Happy Valley on Saturday. I don't think Penn State matches up very well with Ohio State.
Yeah, James Franklin doing an exceptional job on the recruiting trail, but he's gonna have to do that for 2 or 3 years. Ohio State's athletic ability far surpasses Penn State at this point. But the game at night in Happy Valley, maybe they hang in there, but we could possibly see something close to what we saw when it was supposed to be a decent game last year, and it was 49-0 at half. I don't think it's going to get that outrageous, but still, these are 2 different football teams. Got a couple games in the Western Division, a couple teams I'd like to focus on in the Big Ten, Nebraska and Wisconsin. So we've got Rutgers going to Nebraska. Your thoughts about the Huskers at home?
Well, I like Nebraska. You're talking about an offensive line that's averaging over 300 yards rushing per game. They traditionally play Northwestern very tough, or should I say Northwestern plays them very tough over the last couple of years, and they had a dominating road performance in Ryan Field on Saturday night, really wore down the Wildcat defensive front. Amir Abdullah having a great season. It's the speed from Nebraska offensively with Tommy Armstrong and Amir Abdullah, which I think is the difference. You saw what J.T. Barrett was able to do on Saturday. I think it's way too much speed for Rutgers on the road, a Big Ten matchup in Memorial Stadium. I don't think the Scarlet Knights have a chance going up against Bo Pelini's bunch on Saturday. And when you talk about, go ahead.
Go ahead, Joe.
No, I just think they do not match up very well against them. I do like the other game, though. When you look at Wisconsin and Maryland, Wisconsin's offensive line matches up very well against a Terrapin defensive front that's surrendering 198 rushing yards per game. I think that's a recipe for disaster Saturday in Madison. Melvin Gordon, I expect to have a big day. Randy Edsall doing a solid job, dominating performance over Iowa where they fell behind early. But I like the offensive line for Wisconsin to dominate, and I look for Gordon and those Wisconsin running backs to dominate the Terrapins on Saturday.
I find it amusing what the Big Ten likes to do with these newcomers. So when Nebraska joined a few years ago, they made sure they got Wisconsin, Ohio State, Michigan was good at the time, Michigan State. They lined them up. They're doing the same thing with Maryland and Rutgers playing in the East Division. So follow me here, and you know the setup, but I'm explaining to everybody else who doesn't know that you play everybody in your own division. You play two teams in the other division. Both Maryland and Rutgers had the two expected favorites, Nebraska and Wisconsin. Those are their two out-of-division games. Just trying to let the newbies know that you're going to have to earn your stripes in the Big Ten, and you got to play all the tough teams out of the gate. So that's the way it lines up in the Big Ten. Let's move out to the Pac-12. Joe, we've got an interesting matchup on Thursday night where the Ducks go to Cal. Cal got walked over by everybody last year, but this is a different football team. Man, Sonny Dykes has some kind of magic working wherever he goes. Louisiana Tech last, and he's an offensive guru, and he's got a kid in Jared Goff that took his beating last year, but he's got a little bit better talent around him, and they're scaring some people. They've won some football games, beat Washington State, they gave UCLA all they could handle, and now they get a trip from the Ducks.
Very interesting matchup. You're talking about Sonny Dykes doing a great job, has one of the most underrated quarterbacks in Jared Goff. He started as a true freshman and has really progressed his sophomore year, and I think they're a team that you really have to keep an eye out for entering the 2015 season, but I think they're overmatched in this matchup against Oregon. When you look at what the Ducks were able to do the last couple of weeks, dominating performances against Washington and UCLA, you look at this Washington defense, Mark, very physical on the defensive line, led by Danny Shelton. He's got 58 total tackles on the year, 7.5 sacks, 27 sacks as a unit for Washington. Very physical defensive front. They were able to put up over 500 yards of total offense. Offensive line looks like it came together and gelled. That was a problem against Arizona a few weeks ago in that loss at home, 31-24. They look like they solved that issue, and the speed off the edge, I think, is the difference that gets to Goff. I think they have a dominating road performance in Berkeley on Friday night.
You know, it's a shame for Arizona. Missed field goal keeps them from being undefeated at this point. I don't think that they're that good, but still, I would love to see them be in the legitimate conversation right now, just to shake some people up and make some people scratch their heads when talking about this college football playoff. Unfortunately, they did lose at home against USC. They go out to Washington State, where, of course, the Cougars are going to throw it all over the yard. So your thoughts about Arizona going to Washington State?
Tough matchup, but I look at the inconsistencies of Washington State. They have a solid quarterback in Connor Holiday, but they don't have a solid defensive front, and I think that's where the edge falls to Arizona. You look at Solomon, the quarterback, he makes solid decisions, likes to tuck it and run if the play's not there, and I like the way he's making decisions in the passing game as a true freshman, doing a great job in Rich Rod's offense. You look at that Arizona defense, Mark, they're very solid in run support and can rush the passer, and I think that's the difference on the road against Washington State. You saw what Washington State matched up against Stanford. I think it's the same type of defensive front. They're able to pressure Connor Holiday into mistakes, and I think they get a convincing road victory on Friday night.
Hey, Joe, we've got a game here that may not have the national attention that maybe it deserves. This could be a really good football game, a bit under the radar nationally. Arizona State, people counted them out, losing Taylor Kelly, getting blown out by UCLA. They bounced back with a miracle win at USC, looked so impressive in dominating Stanford last week at home. Now they go to Washington. The Huskies still in the mix in the Pac-12 North Division.
Well, statistically, Statistically, Arizona State has won 8 straight games against the Huskies by an average margin of victory of 16 points per game. So that will favor Arizona State as they head into this matchup. I was very impressed with the Sun Devils' home victory over Stanford. I like the way they matched up with the Cardinal in terms of the passing game, stretching that secondary for Stanford last week. Berkovici, a solid performance. The thing I don't like as they match up into this ball game is Taylor Kelly's expected to start against Washington. If it was any other team, Mark, I wouldn't have concerns. But Washington, a solid defensive front, like I mentioned, 27 sacks on the season. They're very solid in run support, and in order to beat Washington, you have to throw over the top. They're giving up around 270 passing yards per game. That would benefit Arizona State, but it's going to take a while for Taylor Kelly to get back into the mix. If Washington could get some pressure early, I think they could be in this matchup, and then if they have to switch to Berkovici late, I don't like that. I like to stick with the hot quarterback. I think this is a tough matchup for Arizona State. When you look at Washington, they're going to have to stretch the field. That has been a cause of concern for Chris Peterson in this offense. They're only averaging 184 passing yards per game, but they play very well at home. I think they're in this game from start to finish, but in the end, Arizona State picks up a 3-point victory.
You know, this college football playoff is going to penalize a league like the Pac-12. And we should have seen this coming, but we expected Oregon to skate through or UCLA or somebody to emerge. But we're looking at like 5 or 6 teams right here in the games we're talking about, plus UCLA, plus Stanford, plus some other teams that are all knocking each other off. That league's probably going to be just a glut of 10-2 teams, 9-3 teams, unless Oregon, I think they're the one shot to get through unscathed the rest of the way and finish with 1 loss and get to the playoff. But here we've got another matchup, USC-Utah. Utah completely off everybody's radar, and they are a really good football team.
Absolutely, and they play much better at home than they do on the road. They did lose to Washington State when they were up by 21 by 1 point. That's the only loss on their resume. Otherwise, they'd be undefeated. You look at USC, they've knocked off Utah in the previous 3 meetings. They're 3-0 over the Utes. When you look at the matchup, Utah, 33 sacks through 6 ball games, Mark. If you thought Washington had a solid defensive front, Utah leads the Pac-12 in terms of sacks. Cody Kessler has been sacked a total of 16 times on the year. He's having an absolute phenomenal season, completing 69% of his passes, 18 touchdowns, only 1 INT. But the difference is that Utah was able to get pressure against teams like Michigan with a mobile quarterback in Devin Gardner and Brett Hundley, where they sacked him 10 times. You know where Cody Kessler is going to be. So I think that this matchup favors Utah's defensive front. If they could get into a low-scoring ball game, I like Utah at home. You look at this USC offense, Boom Allen, 907 yards on the year, but they're a very methodical offense with a physical offensive line in Utah that wears you down, and I think that's the difference, the offense and defensive lines of the Utes at home.
Okay, Joe, let's finish up with the SEC. The slate for this league, not quite as impressive as it's been in recent weeks, but still extremely important football games. We start with the number 1 team in college football. See if I can spit this out because it's Mississippi State. That still doesn't register. Number 1 team in college football, Mississippi State going to Kentucky. And we thought maybe the Wildcats were ready to break through, show us what they had. They go to Death Valley and they get completely stained. So, maybe it could have been a trap game. I don't know if it still has those possibilities, but we got the Bulldogs State.
Well, Mississippi State has owned Kentucky over the last 5 matchups. They're 5-0 with an average margin of victory of 7 points per game. You look at this Mississippi State offense, very balanced, rushing for 264 yards per game and passing for 265 yards per game. So a dual-threat quarterback in Dak Prescott, who, in my opinion, is leading the Heisman Trophy balloting at this point in the season. When you look at the negative for Kentucky, they're solid defensive front, but they're giving up about 172 rushing yards per game. I think that's the difference with Josh Robinson and Dak Prescott on the road. They're opportunistic, though, Kentucky, +9 in turnover margin, very physical defensive line. But how is Patrick Towles going to stretch that secondary? That is the only concern I have if you're a Wildcat fan. I think they can keep it close to the vest, But in the end, way too much offense for Mississippi State, and you're talking about a very physical defensive line in Preston Smith and that Mississippi State Bulldog defense, only giving up around 83 rushing yards per game. I like Mississippi State on the road. I think they get about a 10 to 11-point victory over Kentucky, but I think Kentucky can keep it close.
Wow, keep that one close at 10 or 11 points. Man, I just think the Bulldogs are probably going to blow them out, especially with the week off. Ole Miss at LSU, and I can't believe that we're 9 weeks deep into the season, Joe, and we really have no question about the best defense in college football. Now, things could change in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and especially with the date against Auburn. Really want to see that matchup, Auburn-Ole Miss. But the Rebels have been airtight against everybody, especially Alabama a couple weeks ago in that Texas A&M 4 and 5 wide. They completely shut it down, and so we got the Rebels going to LSU, and LSU finally showing us a complete football game against Kentucky.
Well, this is an incredible matchup. Let's start with Ole Miss's performance last week, 34-3 in Oxford over Tennessee. They held Tennessee, Mark, to 191 total yards. They created 4 turnovers. They sacked Justin Worley 7 times, and they gave up no rushing yards on the day. A dominant performance at home against a solid Tennessee offense. Young, but still putting up numbers for Butch Jones. When you look at what Bo Wallace has done over the last 3 weeks, Mark, 45 of 81, 632 passing yards, 6 touchdowns, no INTs. He's been clean with the football in 3 straight games. He now has to go to Baton Rouge. When you look at the last 5 matchups for Ole Miss, they're 2-3 overall against LSU. They've dropped the last 2 meetings in Death Valley by a total of 13 points. Going to be a very difficult place to play against the Mad Hatter in this LSU defense. LSU's lost 2 games this year to Auburn and Mississippi State. 2 mobile quarterbacks in Dak Prescott and Nick Marshall. Bo Wallace is not that type of quarterback. You know where he's going to be. He does like to utilize the spread, but by no means is he as agile outside the pocket as Prescott and Nick Marshall. I think the LSU defensive front can get a read on him. And you look at this secondary for LSU, only giving up 156 passing yards per game. They're +7 in turnover margin, and I would not go against the Mad Hatter in Death Valley on a Saturday night. I think LSU gets the upset. I like the way the offensive line is playing. Leonard Fournette, I look for a low-scoring game. This is the type of game that John Chavis and Les Miles want to play. I think they want it in the 10-3 type of ball game, but I think LSU strikes the upset on Saturday night.
Wow. Well, it's possible. They're in Death Valley, and they showed us something last week and really stomping Kentucky. And I thought coming out of the gate, game 1, that they would be a much better team, talking about LSU in week 7, week 8 than they were in week 1. And that seems to be trending that way, that this is a very young football team. But, again, they've recruited top 5 classes, so we know that the talent's on the roster. That's very interesting. We got Mississippi State and Ole Miss, and in addition to the rankings of 1 and 3 in the country, they control their own destiny. Alabama and Auburn don't, because Ole Miss has the win over Alabama, Mississippi State over Auburn. So Auburn can win out, and if Mississippi State wins out, they got the tiebreaker, and Ole Miss, of course, over Alabama. That's crazy to think that the 2 Mississippi schools control the SEC West, but that's the way it is right now. Auburn now has a brutal schedule the rest of the year. I think they're up to it, but they have no gap for a letdown. They have no breathing room, and they start with South Carolina. I know it's on the plains, but still a decent South Carolina team comes in.
You're right, and Nick Marshall, in my opinion, very underrated quarterback. It is on the plains in Auburn. Auburn, a little under the radar right now. They're sitting at number 5. Their only loss was to Mississippi State. They fell behind in that ball game 21-0, and then really battled back, but in the rain could not get it done in Starkville. But at home against a very young Gamecock secondary, Coates, Williams, the outside, I think they spread the field against South Carolina. And I think Nick Marshall is way too much. Couple the fact with Dylan Thompson on the road, in order to get the upset, South Carolina is going to have to utilize Mike Davis in the rushing attack. and Auburn's very solid in run support. I think Auburn gets a convincing victory on Saturday night on the Plains.
Okay, we got a traditional rivalry, West versus East, Alabama and Tennessee. I'm going to be interested in the next 2 years, let's say, to see how Arkansas, Tennessee, and Kentucky improve. We've seen them take baby steps. Butch Jones recruiting well, top 20 classes the last 2 years. Same with Bielema. We see the Hogs improving as well. Kentucky under Mark Stoops. Somebody's got to lose games in this conference. So I guess it's going to be Florida. It's going to be Vandy because, man, if those three programs improve and reach the status of these other schools, look out. So anyway, let's bring it back to 2014. We got Alabama coming off 59-0, taking on Tennessee in Knoxville.
Okay, you knew I was high on Alabama last week. We both were in agreement that we thought they would blow out Texas A&M. Thought Texas A&M was a worn-out team when you look at what their last 4 performances were. Went to play Arkansas, trailed that game 28-14, won 35-28. Went on the road to Mississippi State, got beat up in Starkville, went home to College Station, got beat up by Ole Miss, then had to travel to Tuscaloosa. In my opinion, they were worn out and really showed that in their performance on Saturday. You talk about a dominant Alabama defensive effort. They won the turnover battle for the second time in consecutive weeks, held Texas A&M to 172 total yards, put up 602 total yards of offense and balance, 304 passing, 298 on the ground. Dominant effort at home in Tuscaloosa. But I don't put that much weight into that victory because of my feelings about Texas A&M. Alabama's not played that well on the road this year. 2 games in Oxford and in Little Rock. Fayetteville did not play well on the road, struggled in both of those ball games. I know it's Arkansas and Ole Miss, but this is a rivalry game. This is Tennessee's season right now. Lane Kiffin comes back to Knoxville as the offensive coordinator. Tennessee fans dislike him in every way, shape, and form, and look for this fan base to be up for this ball game. Butch Jones realizes that this is the season for Tennessee. All Tennessee has to do is win this game, and 2014 is a success in Knoxville. I expect Tennessee to push Alabama to the limit on Saturday. I think it comes down to a field goal, and I think Alabama might win out, but don't be shocked if they get the upset on Saturday at home.
All right, folks, we've got Joe Lisi on. We have him on every Tuesday late night, 12:30 a.m., and so you can catch it live as we speak, or it posts directly to YouTube and on my channel at MarkRogersTV. Go to his website, goforthe2.com. He's got some amazing college football insight content right there. Joe, what else are you up to these days?
I'm on Fantasy Sports Network, breaking down some college fantasy now each and every week on Cablevision Channel 147, and I make occasional appearances on Sirius XM, and you can catch me every Tuesday night on Yahoo Sports Radio Network with Ken Thompson, live from Vegas, 10:30 to 11:30 on Tuesday nights, sportsxradio.com.
There you go. The guy gets it done each and every day throughout the college football season and the entire year. All right, Joe, always appreciate the time, man.
Love the show, Mark. Can't wait to be talking college football with you next week.